The old ones used to say winter had a voice of its own out on the frontier, not loud like thunder or cruel like a gunshot, but slow and whispering, the way sorrow settles into a man's bones when he's lived too long alone. I remember one such winter years ago, when the sky over the plains turned the color of cold iron, and the wind came howling across the land like it had lost something it could never find again. That was the night Silas Boone rode home through the storm. Silas was the kind of cowboy most townsfolk spoke about in half-sentences, a man seen often enough to be familiar, yet known by no one well enough to be understood. He lived several miles beyond the town of Dry Creek, where the prairie widened and the world grew quiet. His ranch was small, hardly more than a stubborn patch of land and a cedar cabin that leaned a little to the west from years of wind. But it was enough for him, or at least, that was what he told himself. The storm that evening had come down early, heavy and thick, the kind of snow that swallowed the horizon until the earth and sky seemed to blur into the same endless gray. Silas kept his coat collar turned high against the wind as his horse trudged slowly along the frozen trail. The animal's breath rose in pale clouds, drifting away like ghosts in the bitter air. Most men would have hurried home before such a storm, but Silas had grown used to moving through silence. It followed him the way a shadow follows a man at dusk. Still, even a quiet man notices when something doesn't belong. At first it was nothing more than a shape near the roadside fence, half buried under a restless drift of snow. Silas might have passed it entirely if his horse hadn't suddenly slowed, ears twitching in uneasy curiosity. He drew the reins and squinted through the blowing white. The shape moved. Silas slid from the saddle, his boots sinking into the powder with a dull crunch. The wind tugged at his coat as he stepped closer, brushing snow aside with rough hands. It was a woman. She lay curled against the frozen ground as though sleep had taken her where she fell. Snow had gathered in her dark hair and along the folds of her thin travel dress, the fabric stiff with cold. One small suitcase rested beside her, the leather scuffed from a long journey. For a moment Silas simply stood there, the storm pressing against his back. Out here, a man learned early that trouble often arrived wearing the face of someone else's misfortune. But when the woman stirred weakly, letting out the faintest breath of pain, hesitation vanished. Silas knelt beside her, brushing snow from her cheek. Her skin was pale with cold, yet there was life there still, flickering quietly like the last ember in a dying fire. "Miss," he said softly, though the wind nearly swallowed the word. Her eyelids fluttered. When they opened, her gaze seemed distant at first, as though she had forgotten where the world ended and dreams began. "Am I?" she whispered, her voice barely more than air. "Am I still outside?" Silas nodded once. "You are." Her lips trembled slightly, and for a moment she looked toward the empty road stretching behind him. "I thought I wouldn't wake again." The words were spoken so gently they carried no complaint, only quiet acceptance. Silas reached for the small suitcase beside her and opened it quickly, hoping for some clue as to how she had ended up alone in the middle of a blizzard. Inside he found little: a neatly folded dress, a worn Bible with a cracked leather cover, and a letter carefully tied with thin blue ribbon. He did not read the letter. It wasn't his place. Instead he closed the case and turned back to her. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried, but the strength in her limbs had already surrendered to the cold. Her hands trembled violently as she pushed against the ground. Silas sighed quietly, then lifted her into his arms before she could protest. She weighed almost nothing, light as winter straw. He carried her to the horse and helped her settle across the saddle before climbing up behind her. The animal shifted uncertainly beneath the added weight, but Silas murmured to it softly, guiding it back onto the narrow trail leading toward his ranch. For a long while they rode in silence. The storm thickened around them, swirling in restless circles, yet the woman leaned weakly against Silas's coat, as though the warmth of another human being was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. After some time she spoke again. "My name is Faith," she murmured. Silas adjusted his grip on the reins. "Faith what?" "Faith Caldwell." He waited, sensing the rest of the story was pressing against her throat like unshed tears. "I came here to marry a man," she said slowly. Silas was not surprised. The railroads had brought many mail-order brides west over the years, women chasing hope across 1,000 lonely miles. His name was Tom Calder, she continued. The wind carried the name away. Faith swallowed before finishing. He said, I wasn't what he expected. Silas said nothing, but the tightening of his jaw spoke enough. He looked at me after the train arrived, she whispered. Then he said he didn't want a bride who looked like she'd already lived a hard life. Her voice broke gently, though no tears came. I suppose he was right. Silas shifted slightly in the saddle. No, he said after a moment. He wasn't. Faith didn't reply. The rest of the ride passed beneath the low growl of the storm. By the time Silas reached his ranch, the snow had risen nearly to the horse's knees. The cabin stood against the wind like a stubborn old man, refusing to fall. Inside, the warmth of a small firebox slowly pushed the cold from the room. Silas wrapped Faith in a wool blanket and set a kettle on the stove while the storm rattled the shutters outside. For long, while she slept in the chair beside the fire, Silas sat nearby, sharpening a small pocket knife, simply to give his hand something to do. Eventually Faith stirred. Her eyes wandered slowly around the cabin, taking in the rough cedar walls, the worn wooden table, the quiet order of a place where one man had lived alone for many years. You brought me here, she said softly. Silas nodded. Why? The question hung between them longer than expected. Finally he shrugged slightly. Because leaving you out there didn't seem right. Faith studied his face, as if trying to measure the kind of man who would ride into a storm for a stranger. You don't even know me. Silas gave a faint smile that barely touched his eyes. Seems to me the world knows how to be cruel without needing help from me. Faith lowered her gaze to the floor. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, yet inside the small cabin a gentler quiet began to grow. Over the next few days, the storm refused to loosen its grip on the land. Snow buried the fences and swallowed the distant road entirely, leaving the ranch cut off from town. Faith insisted on helping wherever she could. She swept the floor, mended a torn sleeve on Silas's coat, cooked simple meals with careful hands that still trembled slightly from the long journey west. Silas noticed the way she moved to the cabin as though she feared taking up too much space. But little by little, the silence between them softened. One evening she sat by the fire, reading quietly from her Bible while the wind whispered against the roof. Her voice carried a gentle rhythm, steady and calm. Silas leaned back in his chair, listening without interrupting. It had been a long time since another voice had lived inside those walls. Later that week, when the sky finally cleared enough for travel, Silas rode into town for supplies. Faith insisted on coming with him. Dry Creek looked smaller than she remembered. The moment they stepped inside the general store, conversations faltered. Eyes followed them. Martha Briggs, who owned the boarding house, leaned across the counter with the sort of smile that never reached her eyes. Well now, she said sweetly, seems Mr. Boone found himself a bride after all. Faith stiffened slightly. Silas ignored the remark, collecting what he needed, but whispers followed them back onto the street. Faith heard enough to understand the story already forming in the town's imagination. By the time they rode home again that afternoon, she felt the weight of those unseen judgments pressing heavily against her chest. That night she stood quietly beside the cabin door, watching the last light fade across the snowy plains. Silas stepped onto the porch beside her. You'll want to head somewhere else once the road's clear, he said gently. Town can be narrow-minded. Faith wrapped her shawl tighter against the cold. I don't know where else there is to go. Silas looked out across the endless white land stretching toward the horizon. For the first time in many years, his ranch no longer felt quite so empty. And though neither of them spoke the thought aloud, both understood something had begun the night the storm carried her there. But whether it would grow into something lasting, or disappear like footprints in fresh snow, was a story winter had not yet finished telling. Winter did not loosen its grip on the prairie quickly. Even after the sky cleared, the cold remained like a quiet memory buried beneath the snow. Days passed slowly at Silas Boone's ranch, measured by the creak of the windmill, the soft crackle of firewood, and the quiet rhythm of two lives learning how to move around each other. Faith Caldwell worked gently but steadily, as if gratitude had become her way of breathing. She rose early to light the stove, patched small tears in blankets, and sometimes stood near the window, watching the white fields stretch toward the horizon like an unanswered question. Silas noticed these small things. He noticed how she paused before sitting in his chair, as though still unsure she had the right to be comfortable there. He noticed the way she spoke softly to the horses when she carried grain to the barn, her voice patient and kind, the same tone one might use with frightened children. Most of all, he noticed the quiet courage she carried beneath her sorrow. Yet the world beyond the ranch had not forgotten its habit of judgment. Word traveled quickly in a small frontier town, and stories rarely grew kinder with distance. By the time Silas rode back to Dry Creek a week later for supplies, the whispers had already taken shape. Men leaning near the saloon doorway watched him pass with knowing smiles. Women standing outside the mercantile lowered their voices, but not their eyes. Silas had lived long enough to understand the weight of such looks. Still, when he returned to the ranch that afternoon, he said nothing about it. Faith sensed it anyway. That evening she placed 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat across from him with careful composure. "The town believes I've done something shameful," she said quietly. Silas met her gaze. "The town believes many things." She folded her hands together, her fingers tightening slightly. "I never meant to bring trouble to your home." Silas leaned back in his chair, studying the flicker of firelight dancing across the room. "Trouble usually finds its way without asking permission," he replied. "You didn't invite it." Faith lowered her eyes. "Even so," she murmured, "I won't stay longer than I should." Silas felt something shift inside his chest at those words, though he could not yet give the feeling a name. Days slipped by after that conversation, quiet but thoughtful. The ranch settled into a fragile rhythm that neither of them spoke about. Faith helped where she could, her presence slowly weaving warmth into places that had long been forgotten. Silas found himself lingering near the kitchen doorway, just to hear the sound of her humming softly while she worked. One evening, while gathering firewood from a small shed behind the cabin, Faith discovered an old wooden box tucked beneath a stack of tools. Curiosity was not her habit, but the box had fallen open slightly when she moved the logs. Inside lay a photograph. The image showed a younger Silas standing beside a woman whose smile seemed to carry sunlight within it. Snow dusted the edges of the picture, and the paper had grown thin with years. Faith stared at it quietly before returning the box exactly where she had found it. That night, after supper, she placed a small candle beside the photograph on the shelf near the fireplace. Silas noticed it the moment he stepped inside. For a long while he said nothing. Then he walked slowly to the shelf and lifted the photograph in his rough hands. "My wife," he said at last. Faith waited gently. Her name was Clara. The way he spoke the name suggested it had been carried silently inside him for a very long time. "She fell ill one winter," he continued. "The doctor couldn't reach the ranch in time." The room grew very still. "I've been talking mostly to horses and wind ever since." Faith did not offer sympathy with loud words. Instead, she simply sat nearby, allowing the silence to hold the memory without disturbance. It was a small kindness, but Silas felt its weight more deeply than he expected. Outside, winter slowly tightened again. Late one afternoon, the sky darkened with the familiar warning of another storm rolling across the plains. By dusk, the wind had returned with fierce determination, driving snow against the windows in restless waves. Silas was fastening the barn doors when a distant shout reached him through the gale. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks. Then the cry came again. Silas followed the sound across the frozen field until he spotted a horse struggling through the drifting snow. Slumped across the saddle was a man barely holding on. When Silas pulled him down from the horse, the lantern light revealed a face he recognized immediately. Tom Calder, the man who had rejected Faith. Tom's lips were blue with cold, his breath shallow and uneven. The storm had nearly taken him. "Cabin." Inside, Faith looked up from the stove as the door burst open. The moment she saw Tom's unconscious form, surprise flashed across her face. Yet it was followed not by anger, but concern. Silas laid the man near the fire. "He'd have died out there," Silas said simply. Faith knelt beside Tom, wrapping blankets around his shoulders. Then it's good you found him. Silas studied her carefully. You don't hate him. Faith shook her head slowly. Hate is a heavy thing to carry across a long life. Tom awoke hours later, confusion clouding his face as he realized where he was. When recognition came, shame followed quickly. He could not meet Faith's eyes. I treated you poorly, he said hoarsely. Didn't expect you to be the one saving me. Faith's voice remained calm. Sometimes kindness arrives from the least expected place. Tom stayed only long enough to recover strength before leaving the next morning. But word of what had happened traveled through Dry Creek faster than the storm itself. People who had once whispered now spoke differently. Sheriff Holloway tipped his hat respectfully when Faith passed through town a few days later. Even Martha Briggs seemed to run short of sharp remarks. Kindness, it seemed, had a way of quieting even the loudest gossip. Weeks passed. The snow began to soften beneath the early breath of spring. Patches of earth slowly returned to the prairie, like old friends stepping out from hiding. Faith watched these changes with thoughtful eyes. One morning she folded her few belongings neatly into the small suitcase she had carried across the country. Silas noticed it resting near the door. You planning a trip? He asked, though his voice already carried the answer. Faith nodded gently. The stagecoach runs again tomorrow. Silas stood very still. You don't have to go. Her smile was soft but certain. You gave me shelter when I had none. I'll always be grateful, but I can't stay where I was never meant to belong. Silas wanted to argue, yet the words refused to form. The next day dawned bright and cold. The stagecoach waited beside the Dry Creek station while a few passengers loaded their trunks. Faith climbed the wooden steps slowly, her suitcase clutched in both hands. Just before she entered the coach, a familiar voice called her name. Silas Boone rode into town at a hurried pace, snow dust rising behind his horse. He dismounted quickly, removing his hat as he approached her. For a moment neither of them spoke. The town watched quietly from a distance. Finally Silas cleared his throat. I spent a long time believing empty rooms were easier to live in, he said. Then you walked through my door. Faith's eyes shimmered slightly. Silas shifted his weight, uncomfortable with speeches, yet determined to finish. You didn't arrive the way folks expected, he continued, but you brought something better than what anyone ordered. Faith waited. Silas's voice softened. You brought life back to a place that had forgotten how to feel it. The stagecoach driver glanced down the road impatiently. Faith looked once toward the open prairie beyond town. Then she stepped back down from the coach. Silas blinked in quiet disbelief. I suppose, she said gently, a person doesn't need a train ticket to find where they belong. The driver shrugged and cracked his reins as the stagecoach rolled away without her. Silas and Faith stood together in the sunlight while the last traces of winter melted slowly across the land. Neither spoke of promises or futures, yet something stronger than words had already taken root between them. And as the prairie wind carried the scent of thawing earth across Dry Creek, it seemed to whisper a quiet truth the old storytellers always knew. Sometimes the storms that break us open are the very ones that guide us home. So, if this story warmed your heart even a little, stay a while here on Wild West Tales, where forgotten roads still hold quiet miracles. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and ride along with us into the next tale.